Hey there, and welcome back to the second segment of our True Talk Thursday podcast. We will turn now to Dr. Maria Armstrong to continue the conversation. But before we do so, if you like what you hear and want to learn more, feel free to subscribe below or tune in next week, Thursday at 7 p.m. We thank you for joining us.
So, Amanda, you were talking about, from a statewide level, how you're not into the day-to-day, or like I call it, being in the weeds. You're not in the weeds doing the day-to-day routine of things. Yeah. But, you left that up to basically the superintendents to be able to, do what they need to do because they're the experts in their field and in their purview of schools. Yeah. But that all said, that there was also, you sense a shift in movement, even before the new administration took hold. There was this, kind of a feeling that we're gonna keep moving along. Things were going to start to progress, and so how did for Massachusetts, how did your state help with that kind of, like you said, that feel or that momentum when it comes particularly with reopening schools? Where is your state and how's that looking?
Yeah, I think it was really once we felt good as a country, frankly, that the light was at the end of the tunnel with the vaccinations and the vaccine rollout starting to happen and commitments about the acceleration of the vaccine, I think was a really big turning point relative to momentum picking up in Massachusetts around bringing kids back into buildings. And so I think that was a big piece of it. The state did work very closely with a lot of medical experts, both psychologists, because there was a big concern around the mental health impacts that we all know have surfaced, in particular for children from low-income communities. So that was an issue. And then, of course, just the science continued to improve as more research was able to be done over the last year. And I think with precedent being set by other school districts across the country, who some did stay open, right? So there were points of reference that started pointing to this idea that it was time to start the process of bringing kids back into buildings. And I just think that the fever pitch from frankly more privileged and wealthy families was at an all-time high around getting kids back into schools. And so I think that also made a difference. I think it's something that's still left to be talked about, which is those divides because of privilege. I do think we are seeing more families of color, more families from low-income communities starting to, the numbers I think are changing relative to low-income families wanting their children to be back in buildings, but it's still not at the same rate that more privileged white families are demanding to have their school buildings reopen. So certainly that kind of pressure has played a role in the acceleration of buildings opening back up. And then certainly the health data is pointing to the drop in transmission rates, in numbers of COVID cases, as well as, of course, and luckily we're seeing the big drop in deaths as a result of COVID. So I think all those things happening, coming together at sort of the same time in the March timeframe, just this past, well, we're still in March, I'd say sort of end of February going into March, you started really seeing all of those things coming together. And now it seems like everybody's moving toward reopening. And in fact, in Massachusetts, it's now a mandate that all children at all grades will be going back into buildings.
You talked about the various entities within, the health organizations, at the state level, and how, the superintendents were left to do what they know how to do. Were the superintendents ever at the table when when it first broke with the health officials, with state level personnel to be able to say, you know what, we need some coordinated information to be able to, be able to make the best decisions with the information at hand. The reason I ask that is because, even it's a trickle down effect, right? Communication is a challenge no matter where you're at or what you're doing. And so I'm wondering if there were superintendents at the table early on to provide input or solicit any kind of feedback to what was going on at that time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say that I was not privy to what kinds of conversations and when they were happening. I think there's, certainly been some questions of the state about the timing and the expectations.
Mm-hmm.
We are in a state that gives a lot of autonomy to districts to run themselves as they see fit due to the expertise and leadership that resides within districts. And yet, I think that some of the feedback has been, but at a time of COVID and crisis that nobody has ever dealt with this, we almost need more of the support, more of the consistent approaches and expectations being more spelled out for us, because we as individual districts can't be spending all the time trying to figure out what everybody else is doing. So how can the state help us understand that and have more of a blanket approach? And so I do think that there's been some questions, maybe some level of, frustration with that. And I think some of it just has to do with we're in a pandemic. And then otherwise, I think it's because of structures, of existing structures and how things have been done. And it wasn't sort of it wasn't the right approach for this particular situation of COVID. And yet it's what we know how to do. So it's I'm not trying to put anyone on notice on this. I think it's just been a bit of a, as you said, communication is always a challenge. And I would say that has been all throughout the experience for families, between districts and the state, between families and districts. And again, that communication piece has been essential. And I think there's probably a lot of learnings coming out from districts, from the state around communication.
Absolutely.
We kind of forget how important that really is, but it's probably become one of the main reasons why some of this discord exists.
And why some were able to actually pivot and continue. They just said, okay, well, this is what's going on. Okay, well, then we've got to do this. But they had the deposits in the bank, if you will, with their community. Yeah. And so the trust level and the communication, all those pieces that are very relational.
Yes.
They were able to work together, but in other areas where maybe not so much, that wasn't the norm. There was a lot of autonomy, like you said, until, it's, hey, I need to knock on my neighbor's door and the lights are out. So, can I borrow a cord? That kind of thing, it's, you don't know until you've been there, right? How important community is. Yeah. So, in all of that you've just laid out, what did you find is the most proud that you was like, wow, I didn't know that we could do that, or that we did that? It just makes you so proud from your state, but more importantly, your organization. Like, how did your organization lift or come to the occasion, being prepared for what everybody's been going through?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. So I will say that our proudest moment, I think, thus far as an organization is frankly forging ahead with work that we have been doing, and advocacy work that we kicked off over the summer because we were hearing through surveys that we were doing and focus groups we were doing with our families about what really mattered during the pandemic and what some of the most critical impacts were on Latino communities. And so what we've done is we've forged ahead on our work on educator diversity. And we as an organization and we as a state said that no matter what is happening with this pandemic and all of the chaos that's happening with it, we must move forward with our efforts on diversifying the educator workforce because the two are linked. Yep. And we know that by having more Latinos, more African American, more immigrants as our educators, that is going to make a difference in our student outcomes over time. And you can bet if a pandemic ever happened again and we have a diverse workforce of educators and leaders who are from the communities that are serving our students, it's going to make a really big difference with that trust issue and other things that could have been, a different outcome could have happened if we had strengthened that more across the country, frankly, in our educator workforce. So those two things go hand in hand. And so we've been really pushing ahead with an educator diversity focus. And we've actually introduced legislation to the legislature. And most recently, we formed a coalition of organizations that work across the educator pipeline. And we introduced this legislation with priorities that we think is groundbreaking. We think it's different than what any other state is doing. And we think it will really move the needle, both as a policy shift that will happen in Massachusetts. We've been able to get adoption from the two education committee chairs of the legislature. And so they will be supporting and carrying the bill forward. And so that's actually a huge bright spot and a big win for the Commonwealth relative to advancing policy. And along with that, we will be working with our coalition to move forward policy change, culturally responsive teaching, removing hiring bias, like working on real issues that prevent more of our educators from entering and staying in the profession. So I'm really proud that, again, our coalition, our organization, and the state has sort of all stayed sort of and maintained their focus on this particular issue. I think the second thing I'll say is what we learned from our families was that tech equity was a big issue. And we know that that's a big one across the country. We were seeing far too many students who didn't have devices, but more so that didn't have reliable broadband. And so we took that issue on. That wasn't part of Latinos for Education agenda. That's not work that we do, but we recognize that with the pandemic, look, technology is here to stay. And we believe now that it is a basic need and that all Latino children should have access to technology and our families should have access to broadband that's reliable. So we've taken on that work as well in the Commonwealth. And we've been able to, again, get an amendment in the governor's budget in 2021 to launch a commission to study and bring forward recommendations to address this issue. And we picked it because imagine you can't register for your vaccine without internet access. You can't access telehealth without it. You can't do searches for your children's educational information. So it's just, we think that it's so foundational now that so many issues spring out of if you don't have reliable technology. So those would be the two things that I would say about what I'm most proud of that we are doing as an organization, but also what we're doing in partnership with the state.
That's awesome. I do want to talk a little bit more about the ledge that you talked about, and it's specifically with teacher diversity and what that looks like. But we're going to take a quick break before we get into that a little bit more.
Sure.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.